Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. How did a boy, taken from his Christian family in the Balkans, rise to become the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the world's greatest empire? This wasn't an exception. It was the system. A brutal and brilliant machine of human tribute called Devshirme, the blood tax. It forged slaves into masters, boys into the dreaded Janissaries, and Christians into the absolute pillars of the Islamic Caliphate. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire built its power on the sons of its conquered enemies, and how that very power would one day threaten to tear it apart from within. In the heart of the burgeoning Ottoman Empire, a paradox was taking root. Power, absolute and divine in theory, was in practice a fragile thing. The Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, found his authority checked not by foreign kings, but by his own Turkish nobility. These were the great families, the beys of Anatolia, whose cavalry had carved out the empire but who now saw the Sultan as merely the first among equals. Their loyalty was conditional, their ambition a constant threat. Every victory enriched them, every new conquest emboldened them. For a ruler like Murad I, and later the formidable Bayezid I, this was an intolerable state of affairs. An empire built on the shifting sands of aristocratic allegiance could not endure. A new foundation was needed, one forged not of alliance, but of absolute, unshakable servitude. The solution they devised was as ingenious as it was cruel. It was a system that would bypass the Turkish nobility entirely, creating a new elite from the most unlikely of sources, the Christian children of their vanquished enemies. This was the Devshirme. It was more than a levy of boys. It was a political masterstroke. The Sultan would create a class of administrators and soldiers who owed everything to him. They would have no family but the Sultan's household, no land but that which he granted, no loyalty but to his person. They were to be his slaves, his kuler, yet they would wield more power than any freeborn Turk could ever dream of. This blood tax was a desperate gamble, an act of statecraft that redefined the very nature of power. It was a system designed to sever the roots of descent by creating a government of men with no roots at all, save for the one that bound them, body and soul, to the Ottoman throne. Imagine a quiet village nestled in the mountains of Bosnia, or the plains of Thrace. Life is hard, dictated by the seasons and the church bell. Then, one day, the sound of hoofbeats announces an arrival that is not a merchant or a wandering friar. It is the Sultan's agent, the recruiter, accompanied by Janissary guards. A cold dread descends upon the community. This is the day of the Devshirme. The villagers are gathered, the priest clutching his cross, his prayers feeling hollow against the gleam of Ottoman steel. All Christian boys between the ages of 8 and 18 are presented. The selection is a terrifying spectacle of appraisal. The recruiter is not looking for just anyone. He is looking for the best. He checks their physique, their intelligence, their bearing. He asks them questions, searching for a spark in the eye, a sign of the raw material from which a Grand Vizier or a Janissary Aga might be forged. For the parents, it is a torment beyond imagining. To have your strongest, brightest son, the future of your family, chosen is both a curse and, in a twisted way, an honor. A mother's hand is torn from her child's. A father stands stoic, but his eyes betray a shattered heart. There are no goodbyes, only the final haunting image of a small figure being led away, swallowed by the vastness of the empire he is now forced to serve. This was a recurring trauma etched into the collective memory of the Balkans. It was a harvest of sons, a lament sung in whispers from Greece to Serbia, a quiet, profound grief for the generations of boys who vanished from their homes, destined for a life of unimaginable power, purchased at the price of their own soul. The journey was the first stage of their unmaking. Torn from their homes, the column of boys began a long, grueling march deep into the heart of the empire, towards Anatolia or the bustling capital of Edirne, and later Istanbul. This was no gentle procession. It was a deliberate dislocation, designed to erase the world they knew. The familiar mountains and valleys of their homeland gave way to alien landscapes. Their native tongue was drowned out by the Turkish of their guards. They were now a collective, their individual names and histories already starting to fade. Upon arrival, the true transformation began. The boys were handed over to Turkish farming families in Anatolia. Here, for several years, they would live a rustic life, learning the fundamentals of their new existence. They learned to speak Turkish, not as a second language, but as their own. They learned the rhythms of Muslim life, the calls to prayer, the core tenets of the faith. This was the initial cleansing, a slow, methodical stripping away of their Christian Balkan past. The most profound and irreversible step was their conversion to Islam, often sealed by circumcision, a powerful physical and symbolic rite of passage. Their baptismal names were replaced with Muslim ones. Ivan became Yusuf. Constantine became Suleiman. The boy from the village was officially dead. In his place stood a novice, a blank slate upon which the Sultan could now write his destiny. This process was a psychological masterclass in indoctrination. By severing every tie to family, faith, and homeland, the system ensured that the boy's only path to survival and success lay in complete submission and assimilation. He was being reborn, not as a free Muslim, but as a Kul, a slave of the Porte, whose entire being was now the property of the Sultan. After years of learning Turkish and Islam in the Anatolian countryside, the boys were gathered once more. They were no longer the frightened children snatched from their villages. They were adolescents, hardened by labor and fluent in the ways of their new world. Now began the next, most critical phase of their training. They entered the ranks of the Hashemi Oglan, the corps of novices. This was the great sorting house of the Devshirme system. Here, in sprawling barracks in Istanbul or Gallipoli, their lives would be defined by iron discipline and relentless evaluation. Life was Spartan and grueling. Their days were filled with punishing physical labor on public works, construction projects, and shipyards, designed to build their strength and instill obedience. They were trained in the arts of war, archery, wrestling, and the handling of weapons. But this was far more than a boot camp. Throughout this period, they were under constant, intense scrutiny. Officers watched their every move, assessing their intellect, their strength, their temperament, and their ambition. The most exceptional, the sharpest minds, the most charismatic personalities were identified and marked for a higher destiny. They would be selected for the elite palace school, the Enderun, the inner sanctum where future governors, generals, and even Grand Viziers were molded. The rest, the vast majority who were strong and disciplined but lacked that intellectual spark, were destined for the most feared infantry in the world, the Janissary Corps. This was the crucible. It was a system of merciless meritocracy, where a Serbian shepherd's son could rise to command armies, but only by surviving a process that forged loyalty through competition and fear. They were no longer a band of brothers from the Balkans. They were rivals, each striving to prove his worth to the master who now owned their future. Within the innermost sanctum of the Topkapi Palace, hidden from the clamor of Istanbul, lay a world of profound transformation, the Enderun. This was no mere school. It was a crucible designed to forge the human pillars of an empire. Here, the most brilliant, handsome, and capable of the Devshirme boys, the Ich Olan, or pages of the interior, embarked on a journey that would erase their past and write them into the very fabric of Ottoman power. Their education was a masterpiece of human engineering. They were immersed in Islamic theology, jurisprudence, and ethics, ensuring their spiritual alignment with their new masters. They mastered Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, the languages of poetry, diplomacy, and faith. Their minds were sharpened with mathematics, geography, and calligraphy, while their bodies were honed through wrestling, archery, and horsemanship. But the Enderun's curriculum went deeper into the subtle arts of power. They studied music, learning to soothe the soul of a sultan. They learned the intricate choreography of court etiquette, where a single glance or gesture could determine one's fate. They were taught to be discreet, observant, and utterly loyal. This was a place of gilded cages and immense pressure. The boys were constantly observed, their every talent and flaw noted. Competition was fierce, yet it was tempered by a shared experience of profound dislocation. They were brothers in a strange new world, their old families a fading memory, their only father the Sultan himself. From these hallowed halls would emerge the future governors, generals, and, for the most exceptional, the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. A Serbian shepherd's son could learn to debate philosophy with the empire's greatest scholars and command armies on its farthest frontiers. The Enderun was the intellectual heart of the Devshirme, a testament to the Ottoman genius for turning foreign blood into the empire's most loyal and capable servants. While the intellectual elite were being polished in the Enderun, the vast majority of Devshirme boys were destined for a different, harder path. They were sent to the Asemi Oka, the barracks of the novices, to be forged into the Sultan's sword, the Janissaries. Their life was defined by discipline, deprivation, and a fierce, fanatical loyalty. The symbol of their existence was the kazan, the great cauldron. It was more than a cooking pot. It was their standard, their bank, and the heart of their brotherhood. To overturn the kazan was an act of open rebellion. To eat from the Sultan's kazan was to accept his patronage and pledge one's life to him. Their training was relentless and brutal. They were hardened by endless drills, forced marches, and harsh labor, building roads and fortresses. They learned to fight as a single, terrifying unit, masters of the composite bow and, later, the harquebus. They were the first modern standing army in Europe, a professional force that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. A unique social contract bound them. Forbidden from marrying or engaging in trade, their entire world was the core. Their barracks were their home, their fellow soldiers their only family, and the Sultan their singular father. This isolation bred an unparalleled esprit de corps. They were a class apart, slave soldiers who enjoyed immense prestige and privileges, answering to no one but their own aga and the Sultan. This monastic military brotherhood created a force of unparalleled effectiveness. They were not fighting for land or feudal lords. They were fighting for their faith, their core, and their master. When the Janissary warband, the meter, began its thunderous beat on the battlefield, it signaled the advance of an implacable force, men who had been stripped of their pasts only to be reborn as the shock troops of a global empire. In 1453, as the cannons of Sultan Mehmed II shattered the ancient walls of Constantinople, a new world order was being born. But the conquest was more than a military victory. It was the catalyst for a profound political revolution within the Ottoman state, a revolution powered by the Devshirme. The young Sultan, brilliant and ruthless, surveyed his new capital and saw not just a prize, but an opportunity. He was wary of the old Turkish aristocratic families, the powerful clans who had helped build the empire but whose ambitions and entrenched interests he viewed as a threat to his absolute authority. Their loyalties were often to their own lineage first and the Sultan second. Mehmed needed a new elite, a class of administrators and commanders whose loyalty was unconditional, whose past was erased, and whose entire existence was owed to him and him alone. He found them in the graduates of the Devshirme system. These were his men. They had no powerful families to lobby for them, no ancestral lands to distract them, no competing allegiances. They were the Sultan's creatures, raised in his palace, educated by his tutors, and promoted solely on merit and devotion. Following the conquest, Mehmed purged many of the old Turkish nobles from the highest offices of state. In their place, he installed his kular, his slaves. The Devshirme-born Zaganos Pasha replaced the Turkish nobleman Sandarlu Halil Pasha as Grand Vizier, the latter being executed. The message was clear and brutal. The old guard was finished. The new men, the boys taken from Christian villages, were now the masters of the empire. This strategic masterstroke centralized power in the hands of the Sultan to an unprecedented degree. The state was no longer a coalition of powerful families, but a streamlined imperial machine, run by a meritocratic slave bureaucracy that Mehmed had personally cultivated. The conquest of the city was complete. Now, the conquest of his own government had begun. Imagine a boy named Bajika, born in a small Serbian village in Sokolovici, in the rugged hills of Bosnia. He watches his family's sheep, speaks a Slavic tongue, and kneels in an Orthodox church. One day, the Sultan's men arrive. The levy is conducted. He is chosen. His world is shattered. He is taken to a land he does not know, to serve a ruler he has never seen, and to embrace a faith that is not his own. Now, fast forward several decades. The boy Bajika is gone. In his place stands Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful men in the world. He sits on the imperial divan, the council of state, beside the Sultan himself. His word commands armies, shapes policy across 3 continents, and makes kings tremble. His journey encapsulates the astonishing, almost surreal potential of the Devshirme. After being taken, his intelligence was recognized. He passed through the brutal training of the Janissaries and was selected for the elite Enderun school. There he excelled, mastering languages, military strategy, and the labyrinthine politics of the court. He rose through the ranks with dizzying speed. Commander of the imperial fleet, Governor-General of Rumelia, and finally, for nearly 15 years, Grand Vizier under 3 different sultans, including the magnificent Suleiman. As Grand Vizier, he was the de facto ruler of the empire. He commanded the Ottoman armies at the siege of Sigetvar, negotiated peace with the Habsburgs, and even conceived of an audacious plan to build a canal at Suez. He was a statesman of immense vision and competence, yet the shadows of his past remained. He appointed several of his own relatives, still Christians, to high positions within the Orthodox Church. Was it a lingering affection for his roots, or a calculated political move to control his former homeland? This was the ultimate paradox of the Devshirme. A man, severed from his Christian origins, ruling a vast Islamic empire, his life a testament to a system that could turn a shepherd boy into a kingmaker. In the rugged hills of Bosnia, a Serbian shepherd boy named Bajika Nenadic watched his flock, unaware that destiny had marked him. He was one of the countless children swept up by the Devshirme, his name erased, his family left behind, his future now belonging entirely to the Sultan. Reborn as Mehmed, he entered the crucible of the Enderun school within the Topkapi Palace. Here, boys were not merely educated, they were forged into instruments of the state. Mehmed excelled. He learned languages, theology, law, poetry, and the brutal arts of war and statecraft. His brilliance was undeniable, a raw talent polished to a lethal sheen by the Ottoman system. His rise was meteoric. From palace duties he moved to the highest echelons of military command, proving his valor on the battlefields of Hungary and his naval genius at the siege of Sigetvar. But his true domain was power itself. In 1565, Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's most legendary ruler, appointed him Grand Vizier. It was a position he would hold for 14 years, serving not 1 but 3 successive sultans. While sultans came and went, the aging Suleiman, the dissipated Selim the Sot, the withdrawn Murad III, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha remained the constant. He was the true center of gravity, the de facto ruler of an empire stretching across 3 continents. He managed the state's finances, commanded its armies, and navigated its treacherous court politics with a masterful hand. His story was the ultimate validation of the Devshirme, a Christian-born slave, taken in chains, who rose to command the very empire that had enslaved him. He was more powerful than any European king, his authority second only to the Sultan in name, but often superior in practice. The shepherd boy had become the empire's shepherd. The Devshirme system was built on a profound paradox: to create absolute loyalty through the act of absolute severance. A boy taken from his home, stripped of his name, family, and faith, owed everything to his new master, the Sultan. He was a khul, a slave, but a slave of the highest order. His old world was a distant memory, a ghost. His new world was the palace, the barracks, the divan. This engineered loyalty was the system's bedrock. Unlike the Turkish aristocracy with their regional power bases and troublesome family ambitions, the Devshirme officials had no one to serve but the Sultan. Their advancement, their wealth, their very lives depended on his favor. This created an elite of unparalleled dedication. Yet this gilded cage of power was laced with a potent poison: paranoia. The Sultan, surrounded by men of immense talent and ambition whom his own father had taken by force, could never be entirely certain of their allegiance. Was their devotion genuine, or was it a mask for a deep-seated resentment? This suspicion flowed both ways. For the Devshirme graduate, every day was a walk on a razor's edge. A single military defeat, a misspoken word, or the jealous whisper of a rival could lead to disgrace, exile, or the silent visit of the executioner with a silk cord. The very isolation that was meant to ensure their loyalty also made them utterly disposable. They were pitted against each other in a relentless Darwinian struggle for survival and promotion. The man you shared a meal with in the morning could be the one plotting your demise by evening. Power was a constant, terrifying test, a cage whose bars were forged from ambition and whose lock was the ever-present fear of death. Beyond the council chambers and battlefields, another center of immense power existed within the Topkapi Palace, the imperial harem. And here, a crucial and often unseen alliance was forged. The harem was not merely a place of pleasure, it was a political institution, ruled with an iron will by the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning monarch. Like the men of the Devshirme, the Valide Sultan was almost invariably a former slave, a Christian girl taken from her homeland to serve the Sultan. She, too, had been severed from her past and reborn into the Ottoman elite. This shared experience, of being an outsider who had risen to the pinnacle of power, created a natural bond between the harem and the Devshirme administration. The Valide Sultan needed a Grand Vizier she could trust to protect her son's throne and her own influence. The Grand Vizier, in turn, needed a powerful ally with intimate access to the Sultan, someone who could champion his cause and shield him from rivals. Together, they formed a formidable axis of power. Whispers passed through eunuchs and servants, from the harem's gilded chambers to the imperial council. The Valide Sultan could advocate for her chosen pasha, ensuring he received key appointments and the Sultan's ear. In return, the Grand Vizier would implement policies that benefited her and her faction, manage the state's resources to her advantage, and eliminate threats to her son. This shadow government, a partnership between the empire's most powerful woman and its most powerful man, both former Christian slaves, often directed the fate of the Ottoman world. It was a testament to how the system, in its search for undivided loyalty, had inadvertently created new, complex networks of power far from the public eye. The Devshirme system contained the seeds of its own destruction. In creating the Janissaries, the Sultans had forged the most formidable fighting force of the age, a corps of slave soldiers whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute and whose only purpose was to serve the throne. For centuries, this held true. They were the tip of the Ottoman spear, the guarantors of the Sultan's power. But power, once consolidated, rarely remains obedient. As the Janissaries grew in number, wealth, and self-awareness, their identity shifted. They were no longer just the Sultan's slaves, They were a privileged, untouchable institution, the true guardians of the state, and they began to believe the state could not survive without them, but it could perhaps survive without a particular sultan. The first tremor of this cataclysmic shift came in 1622. The young, reform-minded Sultan Osman II, frustrated by their indiscipline and corruption, announced plans to create a new army. The Janissaries saw this as an existential threat. They revolted. In an act that sent shockwaves across the empire, they dragged their sovereign, the shadow of God on earth, through the streets of Istanbul, imprisoned him, and had him strangled. The slaves had murdered their master. From that moment on, the balance of power was irrevocably broken. The Janissaries became the kingmakers. An accession to the throne was now transactional. A new sultan had to pay them a handsome donative, a bribe for their loyalty. If they were displeased with his policies, or if a rival claimant offered more, they would simply overturn their soup cauldrons in the barrack square, the signal for rebellion. The very corps designed to protect the sultan had become his jailer, capable of deposing and installing rulers at will. The ultimate tool of control had seized control itself. In the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace, power was a currency paid for in absolute loyalty, and the slightest suspicion of its absence was a death sentence. No one knew this better than the men of the Devshirme, who had risen from obscurity to the pinnacle of the state. Their existence was a testament to the Sultan's grace, and that grace could be withdrawn with the speed of a silken bowstring tightening around a throat. Consider the fate of Kara Ahmed Pasha, a man of Albanian stock, taken as a boy and forged into a brilliant statesman and general. He rose through the ranks, his competence undeniable, eventually marrying Fatma Sultan, a daughter of Sultan Selim I. By 1553, he had reached the summit, appointed Grand Vizier by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent himself. He was the system personified, a slave who now effectively ran the world's most powerful empire. But the air at the top is thin and treacherous. His appointment had only been possible because of the dismissal of the notoriously corrupt Rustem Pasha, the husband of the Sultan's beloved wife, Hürrem Sultan. While Kara Ahmed Pasha campaigned successfully in Persia, a web was being woven back in Istanbul. Hürrem and Rustem, masters of intrigue, whispered poison into the Sultan's ear. They accused Kara Ahmed of sowing dissent, of corruption, of ambition that bordered on treason, the very crimes of which Rustem himself was guilty. In the autumn of 1555, Kara Ahmed Pasha was summoned to a meeting of the Imperial Council. He walked in as the second most powerful man in the empire. He would not walk out. As the meeting concluded, the executioners entered. There was no trial, no appeal. The Sultan's word was final. He was seized and strangled on the spot, his immense wealth confiscated by the state. His death served as a chilling reminder to every Devshirme graduate, from the lowest Janissary to the highest vizier. Their power, their wealth, their very lives were not their own. They were instruments of the Sultan, and when an instrument was deemed discordant, it was simply broken. For centuries, the Devshirme system had been a mercilessly efficient machine, a conveyor belt that turned Christian farm boys into the empire's staunchest defenders and most capable administrators. Its strength lay in its cold logic. Sever all ties to the past, demand absolute loyalty to a new father, the Sultan, and reward merit with unparalleled power. But even the most rigid systems are vulnerable to human nature. By the end of the 16th century, the magnificent edifice was beginning to rot from within. The first cracks appeared in the levee itself. What was once a dreaded tribute became a source of opportunity. Ambitious Muslim families, seeing the power and privilege afforded to the Janissaries, began to bribe officials to enroll their own sons, subverting the very foundation of the institution. The slave corps was no longer composed solely of converted outsiders with no competing loyalties. Now, it was being infiltrated by men with local connections, families, and agendas. The rot deepened when the long-standing rule of celibacy was relaxed and eventually abandoned. Janissaries began to marry and have children. Suddenly, they were no longer men with nothing to lose. They were fathers with sons who they expected to follow them into the core. A system built on meritocracy devolved into one of hereditary privilege. The sons of Janissaries, born into the barracks, lacked the rigorous training and desperate ambition of the levied boys from the Balkans. They saw their position not as a sacred trust, but as a birthright. Their focus shifted from the arts of war to the profits of peace. Janissaries became a powerful social and economic class within Istanbul, running coffee shops, engaging in trade, and acting as local enforcers. The warrior monk had become a businessman with a musket, more concerned with his guild's profits than the empire's borders. The steel spine of the Ottoman military was slowly, imperceptibly, turning to rust. The ultimate purpose of the slave system was to create a class utterly dependent on, and therefore loyal to, the Sultan. They were his sword, his shield, his shadow. The idea that this shadow could rise up and strike down the source of its own existence was unthinkable. In 1622, the unthinkable happened. The young Sultan Osman II ascended the throne with the fire of a reformer. He was intelligent, energetic, and painfully aware of the decay that plagued his state, particularly the Janissary Corps. During a campaign in Poland, he witnessed their indiscipline and military ineffectiveness firsthand. They were a bloated, arrogant, and increasingly useless drain on the treasury. Osman conceived a radical, dangerous plan: to abolish the Janissaries entirely. He would build a new army, a loyal force recruited from the Turkish and Kurdish heartlands of Anatolia and Syria. It was a direct assault on the very heart of the Devshirme establishment. But secrets in the Topkapi Palace were a currency, and word of the Sultan's plan leaked out. The Janissaries, sensing their own annihilation, erupted in fury. This was not a protest for pay. It was a fight for survival. They stormed the palace grounds, a raging sea of discontent, demanding the heads of the Sultan's advisors. The terrified Osman was forced to surrender them. But it was not enough. The mob, tasting power, dragged the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the shadow of God on earth, from his throne room. He was paraded through the streets of his own capital, subjected to insults and humiliation, before being thrown into the notorious Yedikul fortress. There, in a damp, cold cell, the ultimate taboo was broken. A Grand Vizier, Kara Davud Pasha, gave the order, and the 17-year-old Sultan Osman II was strangled to death by his own slave soldiers. The master had been murdered by his servants. The shockwave of this act of regicide reverberated across the empire. It was the definitive, bloody proof that the system had inverted. The slaves were now the masters. For the Janissaries, the symbol of their corporate identity and their communion with the Sultan was the cauldron. From these massive bronze pots they received their daily pilaf, a gift from their master. To accept the food was to accept his authority. To refuse it, to overturn the cauldrons in the center of their barrack square, was the ultimate act of defiance. It was a declaration of war. By the early 19th century, the cauldrons had been overturned many times. The Janissaries had become a Praetorian Guard run amok, a state within a state. They were kingmakers and king-killers, a reactionary mob that murdered any sultan or vizier who dared to speak of reform or military modernization. They were an anchor holding the empire fast in the past while Europe's armies, forged in the Napoleonic Wars, surged ahead. The empire was rotting, and the Janissaries were the gangrene. Sultan Mahmud II knew this better than anyone. He had come to the throne in 1808 after yet another Janissary rebellion had deposed his predecessor. He watched, he learned, he waited. Unlike the impetuous Osman II, Mahmud was patient, cunning, and utterly ruthless. For nearly 2 decades he consolidated his power, quietly placing loyalists in key positions and, most importantly, secretly building a new, European-style army, the Asakir-i Mansur-i Muhammadiyeh, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. In June of 1826, Mahmud felt ready. He made his move, issuing a decree that a new army corps would be formed, with its soldiers trained in modern European drills. As he knew they would, the Janissaries took the bait. The cry of rebellion echoed through their barracks. They poured into the Hippodrome Square, their old parade ground, and in a final, fatal display of their power, they overturned their cauldrons. The crash of metal on stone was the signal Mahmud had been waiting for. This was not a negotiation. It was an extermination. He unfurled the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, calling all faithful Muslims to his side to destroy the traitors. The final, bloody confrontation between the Sultan and his slaves had begun. By the mid-17th century, the Devshirme system had reached its zenith of power, and nowhere is this more terrifyingly illustrated than in the reign of Sultan Ibrahim. Known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, his rule was not one of policy, but of pathology, and in the vacuum of his sanity, the men who were once the Sultan's slaves became his masters. Ibrahim ascended the throne a broken man, having spent decades in the cafes, the gilded cage, expecting the executioner's bowstring at any moment. This terror shattered his mind. Once in power, his whims were legendary and lethal. He demanded rooms lined with sable fur, obsessed over corpulent women for his harem, and flew into rages that could only be soothed by unimaginable extravagance. The empire, a machine of conquest and administration, could not be run by such a man. So it was run for him. The Grand Vizier, the Aga of the Janissaries, the chief black eunuch, these were the true regents. Men like Grand Vizier Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, a product of the Devshirme, desperately tried to steer the ship of state through the storm of Ibrahim's madness. He enacted reforms, stabilized the currency, and fought corruption, all while placating a sovereign who might order his execution for a perceived slight. This was the ultimate paradox of the system. It had created an elite so competent, so ingrained in the mechanics of power that they could effectively rule without a functioning ruler. But this power was a double-edged sword. When Ibrahim's excesses became too much, when his paranoia and greed threatened the very men who propped him up, they acted. In 1648, the Janissaries, urged on by the Divan and even Ibrahim's own mother, Kosem Sultan, stormed the palace. They deposed the mad sultan, imprisoned him, and 10 days later, with the fatwa of the Sheikh al-Islam, had him strangled. The slaves had executed their master. The Devshirme had shown it could not only create an empire, but it could also decapitate it. The Devshirme, once the bedrock of Ottoman strength, began to putrefy. The engine of meritocracy choked on the poison of privilege. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the system was a ghost of its former self, and its most famous creation, the Janissary Corps, had become a hereditary tumor on the heart of the empire. The levy of boys, the blood tax, became infrequent and then ceased altogether. Why steal sons from the Balkans when the sons of Janissaries in Istanbul were clamoring for a place? The Corps, once forbidden from marrying or owning businesses, was now a deeply entrenched social class. They were butchers, bakers, and coffeehouse owners who were soldiers only in name. Their loyalty was not to the Sultan, but to their corps, their privileges, and their pay. Their symbol of rebellion became the kazan, the great soup cauldron from which they ate. To overturn the kazan was to declare war on the throne itself, a sight that made sultans tremble. The consequences on the battlefield were catastrophic. Against the disciplined professional armies of Austria and Russia, these part-time soldiers were no match. The humiliating defeats and the loss of vast territories, codified in treaties like Karlowitz, were a direct result of this internal decay. The Janissaries were no longer the vanguard of the empire. They were a Praetorian Guard, more adept at deposing sultans than defeating foreign armies. They had murdered the reformer Osman II and would later kill Selim III for daring to create a new, modern army. The system, designed to produce a loyal caste of warrior slaves, severed from all ties but the Sultan, had ironically created a powerful, landed gentry with everything to lose. They were no longer the Sultan's sword. They were a knife held permanently to his throat. Sultan Mahmud II came to the throne over the dead body of his cousin, Selim III, a reformer murdered by the very Janissaries he sought to replace. Mahmud never forgot the sight. He understood a fundamental truth. The Ottoman Empire could either have the Janissaries, or it could have a future, but it could not have both. For 18 long years he ruled with a patient, simmering fury, a vow of vengeance hidden behind a mask of compliance. He consolidated his power, placed loyalists in key positions, and, learning from Selim's fatal haste, he planned his move with meticulous, cold-blooded precision. He began building a new army, the Asakir-i-Mansur-i-Muhammadiyye, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. He trained them in secret, equipped them with modern European weapons, and drilled them in tactics the Janissaries had long forgotten. In June of 1826, the trap was sprung. Mahmud announced the formation of this new unit, knowing it would be the final provocation. As expected, the Janissaries in Istanbul revolted. They overturned their cauldrons and marched on the palace, expecting the Sultan to capitulate as so many had before. But this time was different. Mahmud was ready. He unfurled the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, calling all true Muslims to defend the Sultan against the rebels. The people of Istanbul, long terrorized by Janissary arrogance and corruption, answered the call. But it was the artillery that sealed their fate. Loyal gunners commanded by Kara Jehannem Ibrahim Aga, Black Hell Ibrahim, unleashed a relentless bombardment on the Janissary barracks. The wooden buildings became an inferno. Those who fled the flames were met with canister shot or the blades of the new army. The slaughter was immense. For days, the streets of Istanbul ran with blood. The centuries-old core was annihilated. Mahmud II named it the Vaka-i the auspicious incident. It was a brutal, bloody exorcism, the only way to kill the monster the Devshirme had created. The auspicious incident was not merely the end of a military unit. It was the violent severing of a centuries-old cord that ran deep into the Ottoman soul. With the Janissaries gone, the last vestige of the Devshirme system was erased from the earth. The empire could now breathe, reform, and attempt to modernize in a desperate race against its own decline. The Tanzimat reforms would follow, a frantic effort to build a new identity on the ashes of the old. But the ghost of the Devshirme lingered. What was its ultimate legacy? It was a system of breathtaking paradoxes. It was a blood tax that fueled nightmares in Balkan villages, a memory of stolen sons that would later fuel the fires of nationalism. Yet it was also a channel of unprecedented social mobility, turning a Christian peasant boy into a Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man on earth. It produced one of history's greatest architects, Mimar Sinan, a boy from Anatolia who would go on to define the imperial skyline. For centuries, it gave the Sultan an elite force bound by a singular, fanatical loyalty. And then it produced a class of kingmakers and kingbreakers who bled the state dry. The system designed to eliminate a rival aristocracy had, over time, created the most dangerous aristocracy of all. In the late 19th century, foreign travelers would occasionally report seeing an old man in Istanbul, a relic who claimed to be one of the last surviving Janissaries. One can only imagine his thoughts, a living ghost in an empire that had violently shed its past to survive. He was the final echo of a grand, cruel, and brilliant experiment, an empire built by the children of its enemies, which was ultimately forced to devour its own sons to live.